Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place for thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance and beyond. I'm Matt Connell, Policy and Public Affairs Director at the Chartered Insurance Institute. In this episode, we'll be discussing the recently published CII Economic Abuse Report. This focuses on what economic abuse is and how general insurance providers can better identify, prevent, and respond to economic abuse. We'll also speak about the impacts on individuals affected by economic abuse, how AI and digitalisation is affecting survivors, and how the profession can adapt and evolve in future to better support those impacted by economic abuse. We have with us Alex Devereux from the charity Surviving Economic Abuse, who is one of the authors of the report, and Carmen Powell, the CEO of ISG Group, and someone who has a fantastic insight into the culture of insurance firms and the sector as a whole. Alex, Carmen, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
So Alex, just to kick us off, for listeners who may be unfamiliar with the term, what does economic abuse mean and who may be affected by it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Economic abuse is a really devastating form of domestic abuse. And it's about one partner or ex-partner controlling another person's money, resources, all the things money can buy. And the effects of economic abuse can be so damaging and long-lasting. And it's much more common than people may think. In the last year alone, 1 in 6 women experienced economic abuse, which is around 4.2 million women. And it's important to know that while economic abuse can happen to anyone, we know that women, racially marginalised, disabled, and young women are disproportionately impacted. And it can show up in various ways, but we often see perpetrators misusing financial products to maintain and exert power and control through the monitoring or restricting of someone's spending, blocking access to bank accounts or important policy documentation, cancelling or changing insurance policies without knowledge or consent, and also building up debt in victim survivors' names through fear and threats.
I would like to add something to the very good description of Alex, and that is something that really puzzled me when I was doing the research, that young women from 18 to 24 have particularly high prevalence of having economic abuse, and thinking that they are the digital natives is not like they don't know how to use or control their bank accounts or whatever. It's still about financial illiteracy. And I think that I am particularly worried about that.
Yes, and I guess the thing that comes out there is 1 in 6 women affected by economic abuse. And it's not just about how literate you are financially or in terms of technology. Anyone can be affected. And Alex went over the groups that are particularly affected. So given that it's such a serious crime and that it's so prevalent, I'll start with you, Alex. What do you think a report like this can achieve?
I think the purpose is to really give the insurance industry something practical, something that they can use to help them recognise and respond to economic abuse. We want insurers to understand the prevalence and who is most likely at harm of economic abuse, but also understand the different ways abusers can misuse insurance products to cause harm. But most importantly, we want insurers to know what steps they can take to shut this down. It's about creating safer, more consistent outcomes for victim survivors and closing down those ways that perpetrators misuse financial services and insurance products to cause harm.
Carmen, have you got any thoughts on what a report like this can do?
I do think that it's very much about raising awareness that this can happen to anyone. I have been privileged to attend some panel discussions around abuse, and there is no stereotype. And that is why I was trying to get touch with the young people, that there is no stereotype. This can happen to anybody, even very high level, sophisticated financiers. So for me, it's very important that the awareness is there. And I think that the report will go a long way to do that.
Brilliant. So going just into a little bit more detail into specific products and arrangements, Alex, how can general insurance policies, so thinking about very common ones like home and motor policies, and how can the way that a policy is set up, for example, if it's set up as a joint policy, how can perpetrators take these, what feels like very simple contracts, and use them to harm victim survivors?
Yeah, so we see abusers who cancel, change or take out insurance policies without survivors' knowledge or consent, which can be really harmful. For example, a victim survivor might find themselves unknowingly driving a car without insurance. because although they think they're a named driver, their perpetrator has removed them from that insurance, or they may discover that they're no longer covered. So if they get water damage in their home after a leak and they go to claim, they might realise that they're no longer covered because of something the perpetrator has done. We see abusers blocking access to financial information. So after separation, survivors might not know what policies exist or what type of cover they have, especially if they fled without paperwork because it's not been available to them to access. And we also see perpetrators deliberately damaging property or vehicles. And when this happens, claims are often rejected because the person who has caused that damage is named on the policy as a joint policyholder or as a named driver, which leaves survivors to pay to fix or replace damaged items, which can in turn lead to their own financial strain because they're having to pay to get those items fixed in order to drive to work, let's say. And it doesn't just occur during the relationship. We see post-separation abuse as well, and insurance can be weaponized in this way too, especially in joint policies where an abuser might refuse to consent or refuse to remove themselves from a joint policy, which keeps the survivor financially tied to that abuser post-separation.
Wow, so that's not just one or two things there. It's something that can affect people. Again, yeah.
Yeah.
It was 1 year contracts, but it's not just a 1 year impact, is it?
No, it's continual.
Absolutely.
And to be honest, besides the areas regarding insurance that Alex mentioned, there can be things like, for example, I have a friend that her husband was going through speeding lights, everything, so that she got as many fines and parking fines, speeding fines. So this is not even about a product, but obviously she couldn't even pay for things. Her bank account has been emptied. Her car was clamped. So it's when you are going through a separation and people are feeling very erratic, it just becomes like there's no control. And it really can touch everybody, but women in particular, in many different ways.
Yeah, so often people will be dealing with the insurance impact alongside other financial impacts.
Yes.
And often just comes out of the blue.
Absolutely.
So, Alex, I guess heard about all these things that perpetrators do, cancelling policies, blocking access to details, fraudulent claims. So in practical terms, what changes can insurers make to close some of these gaps?
Yeah, insurers have a really important role to play in closing down gaps and minimising harm. And there are a few key changes that the report calls out that can make a really big difference. The first one being raising awareness. It's so key. We need to help colleagues to understand what economic abuse looks like, how it might show up in insurance, and that's a really essential first step, which leads on to making sure that colleagues are equipped with the right specialist knowledge through training. So firms can work with organisations like us at Surviving Economic Abuse, or C for short, to ensure that their colleagues are trained in a trauma-informed, survivor-led way so that they can spot those signs and then respond safely and sensitively. And part of that response is through making sure there are safe routes to disclose with the right recording mechanisms so survivors don't have to repeat their story multiple times to different colleagues. They should allow for flexibility into decision-making, allowing for discretion on complex cases. So that example where I said a claim is usually rejected because a survivor has caused malicious damage, could flexibility be applied to support that survivor instead? And then finally, when designing those products and services, it's designing them with survivors in mind and working with them to build and test products to design out the risks from the beginning rather than thinking about how you mitigate them after they've happened. All these changes would make such a huge difference in creating safer and more supportive experiences for victim survivors. And some of them are really small steps that you can take now, and then you can work on some of the other ones to make more longer lasting impacts later on.
Absolutely, because it's not just one part of an organisation. I guess you mentioned there sort of systems and very specific skills that people in customer-facing roles have to do. So it's not just one of a firm.
Absolutely. It's at every level. So it's from leadership all the way through to your back office roles, to your frontline colleagues. Everyone has a part to play in recognising and responding to economic abuse.
I guess the plus side is everyone knows they're making a difference on something really, really deeply. I guess another thing affecting us all at the moment is AI. That's all the rage. And the FCA's recently launched its Mills review of AI and its impact on retail customers. Carmen, if I can go to you first, how do you think insurers can ensure that digitisation and digital tools, including AI, don't unintentionally disadvantage survivors who may lack safe digital access or even have their devices monitored by an abuser?
Well, I think that AI is, like in everything else, a double-edged sword. I think that it can strengthen areas like fraud detection and provide more access to financial advice. But at the same time, it really scales personalized scams and enables impersonation and financial manipulation from abuser. And also going back to the literacy, which I think that is really, really important, is that reinforces digital divides where digital gaps persist. And as the report will have shown, the women tend to be less financially literate than men in many cases. So yes, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, and thinking of that sort of double edge, Alex, do you think AI could play a role in, say, identifying red flags for economic abuse?
Yeah, I think digital brings lots of benefits, but I also think it can create real risks, especially if online activity is being monitored or they don't have safe access to devices. So insurers need to make sure that any technology they're using isn't intentionally shutting out survivors or causing them more harm. And firms also need to make sure just that when they're recording disclosures, nothing is stored or displayed in digital spaces where an abuser may have access, like joint account portals and apps. And AI absolutely has a role to play in that, but it's not really an area that we've explored within economic abuse. Because of the nature of economic abuse, it's so personal and it's so intimate. How you train AI to spot those red flags hasn't necessarily been explored fully, but it could be a really positive tool as long as it's applied safely and meaningfully without putting survivors at risk or enabling further abuse. But as I said, it's not something we really explored, but we'd love to. So if there's anyone out there that's looking to look at how AI can be meaningfully used to spot those signs of economic abuse, whether that's through account activity, whether that's through words that people use when they speak to their insurance providers, and they want help in developing what that looks like, we absolutely encourage and we would love to be part of that as well.
I think that goes to the previous questions in which you ask about the products, how important it is to understand the products, to represent all the different groups of society. So, for example, women has got a lot of gaps in many areas, including, for example, health. We are still measured with the same symptoms as a man, whether it's neurodiversity, whether it's cardiovascular issues. And in here is the same. We need women to work with charities like Alex's so that the representation will improve the understanding of what is the cycle, what are all the challenges and risk that can happen at different stages. And that is where it's becoming really important that everybody within an insurance organization, banking, etc., they know where are the pain points for this to happen, and then any solutions or any products and services they take into accountability. This because that is how it's going to improve the understanding. You have gone through that, or you work for an organization like Alex's, you understand what it goes through. And therefore, those services, you have to take into account those experts and not just to use these products like if it was something else. So we need representation at every group that an insurer provides products and services for.
Absolutely. So yeah, back to the point that it's not just about frontline staff, it's about the entire organization. Yeah. I guess on that point of actually detecting the red flags, if technology is at a very early stage, Alex, what kind of training would you recommend frontline staff receive to recognize red flags of coercive control, especially when you've got a joint product where maybe you're only talking to one customer or policyholder?
Yeah, I think frontline colleagues have a really unique role. They might be the first people to notice when something doesn't quite feel right. So the training they receive is really crucial. And they need to be confident in understanding what economic abuse is, how it manifests in insurance products and joint policies. And they need to feel confident and empowered to respond to it in a safe and compassionate way, which is why the report recommends specialist training. Training needs to be trauma-informed, survivor-led, and it needs to be delivered in partnership with charities like us at C, because we need to be able to make sure that colleagues can recognise those red flags, handle disclosures sensitively, and know how to escalate concerns if someone's safety or well-being is at risk. But we also know that training alone isn't enough. While it's really important, it has to be backed up with the right structures behind the scenes. And that's things like clear, safe disclosure pathways, those internal policies, explaining to colleagues what support is available, flexibility to make compassionate decisions in complex situations where there may be a joint policy and an abuser is refusing their consent to be removed. And that's why designing out economic abuse from the start, layered with that training, layered with all the other kind of safe disclosure practices and policies, is the whole wraparound that we need to support victim survivors in insurance.
Because I guess in a way we're letting down the frontline staff if they can have the basic response, but then that empathy isn't backed up by the organisation as a whole. That undermines what they've done.
Absolutely. Frontline colleagues are only as strong as the processes and products that sit behind them. So they can give a really empathetic and a really warm, compassionate response to a victim survivor. But if there isn't the back support that then helps them help that victim survivor, it just becomes a really nice conversation. And actually what you need is that whole system response that then gives a survivor a good outcome.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the report itself, I guess, continuing with the theme of spotting economic abuse, the report highlights that many victims themselves don't always recognise that they're experiencing economic abuse. So Alex, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about how that comes about and also how insurers can contribute to public awareness around economic abuse?
Yeah, there's a really great example of public awareness that launched this year from AXA UK. And you might have seen it on your morning tube commute this morning, but it takes phrases that abusers might say like, you don't need to see the paperwork, I'll take care of that. And it decodes them to reveal what they really mean in the context of economic abuse. So you don't need to see the paperwork really means I'm cutting you off from your financial independence to control you. It's really powerful, it's really simple, and it's really visible. They're on these massive billboards in the underground tube station. So I urge you to Google it after this podcast if you haven't already seen it. And those big public awareness campaigns are great. They get seen by thousands of people daily. They'll be seen by everybody, including survivors, but it needs to be backed up with the smaller pieces of work that are just as vitally important, such as having clear information on what support is available and how to access it on your websites, within your policy documents, within your terms and conditions, so that victim survivors know what support your firm offers and what they need to do in order to access it.
Absolutely. Now maybe looking out for those posters. Carmen, sorry, did you want to come in there?
No, I was just saying that I also was reading about that over half of adults admit they overlook financial red flags in relationships. And again, the majority is from women, but in general, is half of adults, they miss the red flags. So that is quite worried, and that is why having this awareness and this education is incredibly important, because yes, we can train people to help abuse survivors, but at the same time, we need to be so much better that we try to prevent as much as possible and decrease the number of abused and potential abusers, but not giving them power. So for me, the awareness and training is really imperative.
Absolutely. And it's like Eric said, I guess it's understanding that somebody might look like they're doing you a favor by taking hassle off your hands.
Yes.
But actually that participating and really being involved in everything is actually the best way to really sort of manage the relationship and make sure these things can be addressed sort of early on. Yeah. So Carmen, I guess looking across it as a profession as a whole, thinking about all the different skills that we've looked at, kind of around not just frontline and communication skills, but product design and service design skills. As a profession, how can we go about making sure that we've got the right level of skills and awareness to address issues like this properly?
I think that, as I mentioned before, it has to be multi-layer. It's about, like I mentioned, raising awareness that this is an issue and a very, very large issue. Training, how to understand and see the signs of the red flags. From insurers, we've been talking about making sure that they connect with people that are experts and the product services, safeguarding, all those sort of areas are in place so that any issues before and after can be sorted. And then as another level as well is to be able to lobby and talk to government and official organizations to provide safeguarding frameworks and just support the awareness and prevention, because sometimes the issue that we have is that they are charities. So normally are charities that they are very low in funding, organizations like yourselves and ours that are not for profit. So we don't have a huge amount of budget to do this sort of thing. And I do think that is the responsibility of across industry and also the government to be able to put proper budgets so that these sort of issues can be tackled, because at the moment it's very much like a piecemeal. In ISC, for example, we have forums that we call Breaking the Silence, and it's about helping abused women, getting people to discuss it in a very safe space, and even providing digital rooms so that two people at a time, they can talk to each other. So we do quite a lot of stuff, but again, it's also of our resources because we are a non-profit. We sometimes have panel discussions that we involve lawyers and financial services about, banking. What are the problems around separation and divorce? How women feel totally trapped because most of the assets are in a house and they tend to be looking after the children. And then can they carry on working? So it does affect women in so many different ways that I do think that it needs to put some budget behind. Billboards and all that sort of thing is really great. For example, if you live in London, a lot of people are now working from home. So how do we get to those people to really understand? And as we become, as a society, a little bit more isolated, how are we going to deal with that? And I just would like to conclude this question about young people. Young people, they have much smaller sort of circles. So the relationships, they tend to be very much online. So the depth of the relationships perhaps is not, or communities not like they were before. So I think that will show this generation to become a lot more vulnerable if we don't raise awareness, even at the schools and universities. What are the red flags that we should be looking for? So I think that there is a need for resources to be pulled together and not to have a piecemeal, because none of us have got the budget to do anything that is going to be truly meaningful.
That was a huge number of points in that. I wanted to explore a bit further. I guess one that immediately comes out, Carmen, you're talking about experiences of different generations, experiences that you have in ISC of women who have experienced economic abuse. So I guess insurance is an evolving profession and it is becoming more diverse. But what do you think is the lesson here for the way the insurance sector is structured and the presence of different groups, different generations, different genders, et cetera, within firms and within the sector in order to make sure that this issue can be dealt with properly? Do you think we're set up for that, or what kind of things do we need to do?
Well, the answer is I don't think that we are set up for that, because like I mentioned earlier, if we are still being insured on a health insurance according to men's bodies, being given dosage for a man's body that usually are bigger than a woman's body, if something so fundamental as, for example, heart strokes being the biggest killer of women, well, worldwide, but let's talk about the UK, because women cannot recognize the symptoms because we are bombarded in films and the media of what a heart stroke looks like. But that is what it looks like for a man, not for a woman. So if we look at this really fundamental big issue that touches so many women and so many lives, because if a woman has a stroke, it just has a knock effect in society, in insurance, in employers, family, at every level. So the reason why I'm bringing this in is because if we don't have that, I think that financial abuse is probably a smaller or seen as a smaller problem. And therefore, we are not preparing to really recognize all the different gaps that women have in every sense of their everyday lives. So no, I don't think that we are. I think that, again, I would like to say that there are a lot of us doing stuff around the subject, but without having the proper resources to tackle everything, it's just going to take a very long time. And that worries me.
Yeah. And maybe bring Alex in here, because you mentioned the resources from the point of view of a charity like Surviving Economic Abuse. Alex, is there anything you wanted to say about your experiences of where resources are being allocated, where they could be allocated?
I think Carmen's made some really good points, and I probably don't have much more to add, but absolutely, allocation of resources, where you're going to put those resources is really key. And you're right, firms don't necessarily have huge budgets, but using those budgets in the right way, working with charities who have the research, they have the lived experience community, they have the skills and the knowledge to share, and working in partnership with insurance providers creates a really collaborative approach rather than insurers trying to do it on their own and charities trying to do it on their own. If we can work together collaboratively and pull those resources together, so the skills and the knowledge of how products and services work from the insurance industry, and then the skills and knowledge that charities like we bring, and the lived experience that we have understood from our community, and that is highlighted throughout the guidance, we can work together to create solutions that work for survivors, but also work for the insurance practice as well. So collaboration, I think, is really key.
Absolutely. And that really efficient way of doing things as well. The expertise is centered within a few organizations that do that full time. And then the wider sector, large firms and small firms, can tap into that expertise rather than everyone having to build it from themselves from scratch.
And I think it's really important that we use lived experience in the right way because it's so incredibly valuable, which is why the guide is grounded in that lived experience of survivors through all the case studies that we present. Because when you put survivors at the center of what we do and why we do it, and when we learn from them and when we bring their insights into that designing and decision making and cultures of firms, it really leads to genuine supportive outcomes, but it also leads to insurers feeling proud of what they're doing and charities being able to evidence the great kind of support that the industry is doing and how they're supporting survivors.
Absolutely. And on that thought, just to round off, maybe you first, Alex, if there's one piece of advice that you'd give to individuals listening to this podcast, one practical element of what they can do to combat economic abuse, what would that piece of advice be?
Get in touch. Read the guidance. Yeah, start by reading the guidance. There's already some really good practice happening across the industry and the report pulls it all into one place. Read it, talk about it internally, get the ball rolling to start making those changes in your firms. And equally, we're expecting guidance later on in the year from the ABI, who are focusing on other types of insurance as well. And that's following the government's call to action in the financial inclusion strategy, where they name insurers as key to responding to economic abuse. I also think a call out to leadership. Leaders are really important to getting the ball rolling and putting their head above the parapet and removing barriers so that victim survivors can access insurance safely. And we've seen a really good example that I want to make sure that we talk about here, which is AXA France, who have added into their policy terms and conditions and domestic abuse. And those three words, and domestic abuse in relation to emergency housing support, put survivors in the same category as people affected by fire or flood, which is really bold and really courageous. And we would love to see UK insurers following in those footsteps. So I think it's twofold. It's what practical, small changes can insurers and firms implement that will have meaningful change. We've talked about training and awareness, but equally, what can leadership do to set the bar and raise the bar for other insurers to follow? Because the more we work together, the closer we get to creating that insurance sector where victim survivors can safely and consistently access good outcomes. So yeah, get in touch with C. We can support. And we'd really love to see some of this recommendations within the guidance coming to light in the UK.
That's brilliant. Carmen, what would your piece of advice be?
I will say take action and do something now. The time is now. I was just looking that, again, there is a 62% increase in the fact that the complex technology has facilitated cases of abuse. So the increase in 2025 is 62%. So the time is now to do something. And this will resonate with you, Matt, because the CII's mission is about improving trust, disclosure, and confidence in financial services. And therefore, I think that what you are doing, getting different people together and all doing our little bits, is incredibly important. We need to increase trust in the profession. And for that, I think that collaboration and partnerships around important areas like this is key.
That's fantastic. What a great set of thoughts for us to finish on. Thank you so much, both of you, for speaking to us on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Journal Podcast. You can find useful links in the show notes and related articles on the Journal website, along with further podcasts. Please like, review, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.